So in our first lecture, we talked a little bit about the evolution of a cell and how molecular changes and selective pressures put on by the environment can cause evolution of life to occur. If you remember, the Stanley Miller experiment talked about the first cells and how it was possible that they were derived in the crazy primordial conditions that were on our planet 3.5 or 3.6 billion years ago. And so let's remember what those conditions were like. We had a methane atmosphere, we had hot air, volcanic action. It was really, really aggressive and dangerous outside, right? And then first organisms evolved and they altered the atmosphere to be an oxygen-based atmosphere. And eventually there was a movement of life from the water to the land. So organisms stayed in the water for a really long time because of a couple of different properties of the ocean. First of all, it's a good pH buffer, and that means that it maintains a pretty steady pH. It also is a universal solvent, so there was lots of minerals and salts inside of the oceanic waters, and so that was really good for life forms that were evolving and needed access to that stuff. And then you also have the last and probably the most important part of or property of water for living things, and that is that water takes a really long time to change temperature, and so it's this nice stable environment for organisms to live in. But eventually there's this open niche outside, and as the outside environment became less hostile, organisms evolved to take part of that niche or to take advantage of that niche. But in order to take advantage of that niche, they had to overcome some pretty major hurdles. The first one is desiccation. Desiccation means to dry out, and that's a key term I would put in your pocket. The other one is metabolism. How are they going to obtain food? It's harder to obtain food on land than it is in the water when your minerals and nutrients might just float straight to you. There's reproduction. How is it that you're supposed to find a mate? In the ocean, you can just release gametes into the water and hope that they find each other. On land, because there's not that medium for the gametes to travel in, there can be a challenge there. And the last is gravity. Your body is supported in the ocean, and so that's why so many invertebrates don't have scales or spines or skeletons, that are invertebrates, inside the ocean. Jellyfish can float just fine, but once you get a jellyfish out on land, it's not going to be able to move anymore because it's not supported by the pressure of the water. And so gravity actually was a major force that played a part in keeping organisms in the water for so very long. This lecture is going to start off talking about plants and plant anatomy and how plants developed the anatomy to be able to move from the ocean onto land. So the first major development for plants was vascular tissue. So the first plants that moved onto land, like mosses and liverworts and hornworts, they were non-vascular plants, which means they didn't have tubes to carry nutrients and aqueous solutions all over their body. And so they were limited in size. They also have gametes that are dependent on water to move. Vascular plants, however, develop these tubes to bring nutrients up from the soil and to bring water up from the soil and to bring other products of photosynthesis from the leaves all the way down to the roots. And so those are called vascular plants, which have a vascular system, just like we have a vascular system where arteries move away from the heart and veins move towards the heart. Their vascular system moves up the tree or down the tree. These are an example of what those tubes might look like. These are vascular clusters. And those vascular clusters run all the way from the roots all the way to the top of the plant. The two major sections of a plant are going to be the root system, and the root system stays underground, and the shoot system, which stays above ground. Roots have several main jobs. The first is to obtain nutrients, the second is to obtain water, and the third is to anchor the plant into the ground. If you look at the plants here, you can see that the tiny root hairs that extend out from the main roots are there to increase the surface area for better nutrient and water absorption. The shoot system includes the stem of the plant, sometimes referred to as the trunk of the plant, the leaves, the buds, and the flowers. Sometimes the shoot system can even have very different roles, like the rhizome in ginger plant, or for nutrient storage for things like onions and tubers. The leaves are an important organ for the plant as they are the fundamental organ necessary for photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is necessary for sugar production, which then can later be used by the mitochondria and respiration to produce energy for the plant. The leaves also allow for gas exchange using stomata, which create these little holes in the bottom of the leaf surface that look like this. These are open stomata, and you can see that they're open because that slit's open right there, and air can enter and exit. So gas exchange is a very important role of leaves. Also transpiration, because during that process of gas exchange, water is evaporated out of the leaves. Some leaves have secondary functions or their primary function has been altered. So here you can see this is a modified leaf in the tendril of peas. These spines don't do photosynthesis at all. In fact, the trunk of the plant does the photosynthesis, and the leaves have been modified for protection. In the poinsettia, during reproductive time, the poinsettia, these leaves right here, turn bright red to attract pollinators to the little tiny flowers. And in succulents, like cacti, the leaves can be modified to store water. This is the basic structure of a leaf. So you can see that you have densely packed cells here at the top, and then you have less packed cells here in the middle to allow for better gas and water exchange. And this right here is one of the vascular bundles. And so you've got the xylem and the phloem. The phloem flows down, filled with sugar, and the xylem brings water up from the roots into the leaves of the plant. Just a key question for you all. I hope you're ready for this during class time. But the key question for this section is, which do you think is going to have more chloroplasts in the cells? The top of the leaf or the bottom? And explain why. The root and the shoot system strongly depend on each other because the shoot system is responsible for creating sugars, which then are moved into the root system. And the root system is responsible for gathering water and minerals, which are then transported into the shoot system. To summarize, light energy, or sunlight, is used by the leaves to turn CO2 and water into sugar. That sugar moves down the phloem to the roots. Meanwhile, nutrients and water are uptaken from the roots and moved to the leaves of the plant. The vascular system is very important to plants, just like our vascular system is important to us. And you can see here's a picture of a dicot plant. So there's two different types of vascular systems in plants. There's dicot systems, and then there's monocot systems. And in this dicot system, you can see that in the roots, the vascular system is clustered and clumped together, while in the monocot, it's in a ring. We talked previously about transpiration, which was tree sweat, right? So tree perspiration, transpiration, or tree sweat. And that is the evaporation of water from the top of the plant. Water, if you remember correctly, moves along a water potential gradient. And so it moves from a high water potential in the earth into the roots, which have a lower water potential, into the leaves, which have an even lower water potential, out into the air, which has the lowest water potential. So if you broke open a leaf, it would still look pretty moist, even when the air wasn't. So transpiration occurs from the top of the plant, and it also helps water movement up the plant. So how does that work? Well, if you think about these tubes I've been talking about, if you thought of them as tiny straws, and you've got evaporation here at the top of the leaf, that creates a negative pressure gradient. or a suction at the top of the plant, and that's going to help to pull that water up from the root all the way to the tippy top of the plant, even the biggest tree. Some key terms that I'd like you to take home are xylem, X-Y-L-E-M, and phloem, P-H-L-O-E-M. And I'd like you to remember that xylem, the water moves up from the roots, and phloem, the sugars flow down from the leaves. So to review, water and minerals come up in the xylem from the roots using transpiration and that negative pressure as a driving force. The sugars come down the phloem, and that is from a positive pressure. So as the sugars are produced, it's actually going to push the sugars all the way down to the tips of the roots. Gas exchange is necessary for photosynthesis and also to allow for transpiration in the stomates of the leaves. So we all know what the movement of water across the cell membrane is called, and that is osmosis, right? So we have this passive transport. Ooh, do you remember that term, passive transport? Doesn't take energy, and that is usually facilitated by a passive transport protein. In this case, the proteins that allow water to move through are called aquaporins. And so the water just moves from high concentration to low concentration across the membrane, from the soil to the root cells, and into the xylem. However, mineral absorption is a little bit different. That requires active transport. If you remember, that means that active transport requires proteins, some sort of pump or something that utilizes ATP or cell energy in order to make it move against a concentration gradient. But plants have other little helpers. They have mycorrhizae, which help to increase absorption of nutrients and minerals from the soil. So they're already moving against the concentration gradient. You have to think that cells have a lot more minerals than a soil probably does, right? So it's got to go from low concentration to high concentration. But we have this fungus that lives with the plant roots, and it actually pierces into the roots, and it steals some of the sugar that is moving down the phloem into the roots from the top of the plant. And it takes that sugar and it uses it to grow, right? But at the same time, fungi are really good at decomposing things, and so they exude enzymes and they break down the nutrients and the minerals in the soil, and then they transport those nutrients and minerals into the roots for the plant. So it's a great symbiotic relationship. I want you to think back. Is this mutualistic? Is it parasitic? Is it commensalistic? If you said mutualistic, you're on the right track. So here's another key question for you. In maple sugaring, they tap into the trunk of a maple tree. They tap into one of the types of the vascular tissue. If it is producing sweet maple syrup, what type of vascular tissue do you think it's tapping into? And how does it get from the leaves down into the trunk of the tree? The last key question of the day is carnivorous plants. Are they really carnivores? Would you classify them as autotrophs or heterotrophs? And why? They do kill organisms to obtain extra nutrients, but they still perform photosynthesis as their primary sugar source. What do you think? Autotrophs, heterotrophs, and why? I also wanted to remind you of our 3 key terms for the lecture, which were xylem, phloem, and desiccation. Please come to discussion with the knowledge of what those 3 terms mean,